My name is Lauren Naden, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of Governors for Schools to our session on Pupil Premium. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us already. Next slide, please. While we're waiting for more to join, I'll briefly cover some housekeeping points. The session is being recorded, and we're going to be sharing a link to access all recordings and resources from the conference later on this week or early next week at the very latest. This event is also CPD accredited. If you would like to receive a certificate of your attendance, please give your consent to share your data in the survey that's going to pop up as you leave the session. If you have any questions for our speakers, and we hope you do, please post those into the chat box and we'll endeavour to get to as many as possible. Finally, we would like to thank the Institution of Engineering and Technology for sponsoring this conference. Now, without further ado, let's get into the session. We're joined today by two fantastic speakers. First up, we have Georgina Burt from Child Poverty Action. Georgina is the England Development Manager for the UK Cost of the School Day, where she works alongside schools, local authorities and policymakers to make schools more inclusive and equitable for children from low-income families. We'll then hear from Professor Becky Frances. Becky is CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation, whose work is dedicated to breaking the link between family income and educational achievement. Next slide, please. Over to you, Georgina.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Georgina and I do work for Child Poverty Action Group, and I'm going to very briefly sort of give you a little bit of an overview of child poverty as it currently is and some of the things that we have found through the UK Cost of the School Day project in terms of how children in low-income families experience schools, and hopefully leave you with some questions for you as governors to consider how it might relate to your schools. If I could have the next slide, please. So I think just first of all to say, to really set the scene, that we know that on average 8 children in every classroom of 30 will be living in poverty. This is a figure that we take in March of every year from some statistics that are released. So this figure doesn't yet capture the full impact of the cost of living crisis, but this is the reality for many of the schools that you will work with at the moment. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. One of the challenges we have though in schools, and this session will give lots more insight on this, is that actually in schools what we use to identify families that might be struggling financially quite often is those that are eligible for and in receipt of free school meals. And this measure of identifying families that might be living on a lower income is of use to us in schools in terms of being able to target resource at families that might need additional support. But one of the big challenges we have with this, and again it's really relevant and pertinent for governors, is that not everybody who is eligible for free school meals is actually signed up to free school meals. Because that registration isn't automatic, it's something additional families have to do. And the last time we had research on this carried out, it was discovered that 11% of people who are eligible for free school meals not only don't take them, but haven't actually applied for them. So I guess one question to leave you with, and it might be something we come back to, is in your schools, is everybody that's potentially eligible identified, signed up and claiming that entitlement, which not only means that the family gets the free school meal or the child gets the free school meal, but of course it means that schools then have the full Pupil Premium allocation that they should have. Next slide, please. One of the other challenges or considerations for families living in poverty at the moment, however, is that because of the thresholds we have around free school meals, 1 in 3 children growing up in poverty aren't actually eligible for free school meals and by extension Pupil Premium. So you'll see the figures on the screen in front of you. Across England, we estimate that to be 800,000 children that are living in a household where things are sometimes difficult when it comes to money, but not in receipt of free school meals and Pupil Premium. And you'll be able to see the breakdown by region. I guess what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about is if as governing boards we explore how we can support pupil premium families particularly through whole school approaches, and really make sure that we're being inclusive when it comes to costs and money in school for pupil premium families. It's a way of reaching families living in poverty who might sit outside of our current thresholds, and I'll give some examples of what I mean by that. But there are ways of making sure that, as well as really supporting that identified pupil premium cohort, there are steps and things that we can do in schools that will have a benefit to families that might just find things a little bit more challenging, particularly over this winter. If I could have the next slide, please. So here at Child Poverty Action Group, for the last 3 years, we've been working with schools and local authorities on a project called The Cost of the School Day. Through this project, we have spoken to parents, pupils and staff to understand what school is like for families if things are more difficult or if there's less money within a household. We've now spoken directly to over 8,500 children and young people. So we have a huge amount of people voice on what that experience of school is like sometimes if things are more difficult when it comes to money. And what we've heard from children and young people and families through the duration of this project is that actually attending school often comes with some hidden and unintentional costs that make it more difficult for those in lower income households to fully participate in everything that schools have to offer. So we've heard about the costs of uniform and resources and stationery and music lessons and trips and the disco and the prom and the Christmas fair. And actually what families have told us that where these costs exist, it's putting household budgets under increased pressure. It also means that children sometimes miss out on the wonderful things that our schools offer. And it means that children can feel different from their peers. So if I could have the next slide, please, that would be fab. And there were 4 topics in particular when we looked at the themes we've seen across that quite large sample size of pupil voice in terms of issues that have been identified by children and pupils. The first, if we go to the top corner, is around curriculum and learning. So children and young people have told us that the cost of purchasing resources for their subjects is sometimes a challenge. Things like revision guides, textbooks, set texts for English, but also specific equipment that might be needed for certain subjects, such as PE kits to take part in PE, or materials for art and design, or a camera for photography, or the quote on the screen there about I wouldn't have done it if I'd known the cost. That refers to the cost of purchasing ingredients for food technology lessons. So as well as having an attainment gap, which I'm sure we'll all be familiar with, what some of the research shows is that we actually have a participation gap in certain subjects as well. That means pupil premium students are less likely to opt to take certain subjects at GCSE in comparison to their peers. And not all of this, but some of this might be understood by looking at some of the costs associated with particular subjects too. So we've heard from young people that access to the curriculum can be impacted by hidden costs. We also heard lots from young people and families around how the school food system works. So not just free school meal eligibility, but practically how it works when they're in school. So what we heard from children and young people is if they owe money for lunches, if they face debt with dinner money, that it might mean that they have to return food in the canteen when they get to the till, or that they are given access to only some of the options at lunchtime and not all of the options at lunchtime. Children and young people also told us that if they're on free school meals, sometimes they can't get the same options as their friends because the pricing of food is outside of the free school meal allowance, or that they're only allowed to use that free school meal allowance at lunchtime. They can't use it at break time or breakfast time. Again, meaning if they're going to clubs over lunchtime, they're not getting access to that free school meal money. What we also heard is that some students are still able to identify which of their peers are in receipt of free school meals, because quite often when trips are organised, it's only those on free school meals that will take a lunch provided by school, which quite often comes in a brown or white paper bag. So from pupils' perspectives, there are some challenges if you're on a lower income around food in school. We also heard that it impacts on engagement with fun at school. So things like trips and after school clubs, if they cost money, that it can mean that families miss out, or children miss out on being able to take part in those things. And also just some of the smaller calendar of events that happens in schools. So cake sales and non-uniform days and dressy up days and fairs and proms and leavers books. That all of these things that are actually, I guess, sometimes the things we remember about school can be the things that lower income children might miss out on. We also heard that young people sometimes feel as if they face stigma at school, either if they don't have the right uniform, and uniform sits within the remits of the governing body. So if there are lots of sanctions associated with an expensive uniform policy, and vice versa, that actually on non-uniform days, that's equally as challenging for some children and young people if they don't have the same clothing as their peers to fit in. So it's a really quick snapshot, and I'll end by directing you to where you can read more on the research that we've done. But I guess before I start sort of wrapping up, just to say that you know, listening to children and young people has been really powerful in terms of understanding. If you explore the school day from start to finish and really understand some of the barriers or points of difference where pupil premium children or lower income children are having a slightly different, yet probably unintentional experience from their peers, that if we explore that, it might make us think about just how things could perhaps be done differently to make sure that there is equity of opportunity and experience during the time children are at school. Next slide, please. So I'll just flag, and we'll leave these perhaps, you know, for you to reflect on, and I know the recording and the slides will be shared, but these are really useful questions we think for a governing body to explore what it does actually cost for families and pupils to fully participate in the life at your school, and where can these costs be reduced. What supports your school currently offering? What monitoring do you undertake to determine not just what's happening in terms of attainment and learning, which is, you know, absolutely crucial, but actually as to whether or not there is that equality of experience and opportunity, whether or not everybody is being able to take part in things at school. And how does pupil voice inform policy and practice at your school? So they would be my questions to you, but happy to take some questions myself at the end. And if you could just pop the next slide on for me, just to flag, we've got some resources to help with this. So there is new guidance on school uniforms that's been published by the Department for Education, which we produced a guide to sort of complement that. And we also have things like a calendar which sets out all of the events that happen over the course of the school year, and has some suggestions on ways schools could approach these so that they are even more inclusive for families, particularly as we go into this winter, with it looking more likely that families finding things a little bit tricky are likely to increase. And then the last slide is just my contact details, and I will hand back to Lauren. Thank you.
Fantastic, and thank you so much, Georgina. That was really useful to hear about some of the experiences of children on Pupil Premium, and some of the ways that governors might want to think about those children's experiences. Just to remind the audience that the Q&A function is there, so if you do have any questions, please do pop those, and we'll get to those as many as we can at the end. And I'm now going to hand over to Professor Becky Frances. Next slide.
Thanks so much. That's very kind, Lauren. And as I've already been introduced, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I think all our audience will be aware that it's social inequality, and particularly the wealth gap between families, so family wealth, which is the strongest predictor of educational outcomes in the UK case. And this slide really exemplifies the double challenge here. The infographic is from EPI, and you can see that kids arrive into the education system with already a gap, showing the point about social inequality driving this. But the second point is that that gap doesn't narrow as kids progress through the education system, it actually gets wider. So that's the challenge for us as educationalists to ensure we're turning that round. Of course, if I can have the next slide, that is doubly difficult since the pandemic, because we can see the impact now that the pandemic has had on the social gap for educational attainment. We've been collating the most robust evidence in this space on our website if you're interested. 59% of pupils achieved the government's expected standard in reading, writing and maths this year in Key Stage 2 stats, which was down from 65% in 2019 and the lowest since 2016. So we can see that fall overall, and data shows that the proportion of pupils reaching a scaled score of 100 or more fell in every discipline apart from reading, where it rose just very slightly. So it's the pandemic and that learning loss has affected kids right across the board, but the proportion of non-disadvantaged pupils meeting the expected standard in reading, writing and maths only fell from 71%, that higher bar, in 2019 down to 65% this year, whereas the drop for poorer pupils was from a lower bar of 51% right down to 43%. And attainment has fallen in every region, but we again see that inequality now mapped across the country, with often the most socially disadvantaged areas and areas in the North and the Midlands more affected than more affluent areas and areas in the South. And of course, as we've already heard, the cost of living crisis will be exacerbating these challenges and the gap even further. And the context for schools and for families is very difficult, with school funding, as many of you know as governors, very, very squeezed at the moment. So that question of how we can support this issue and how we can ensure value for money in really difficult fiscal circumstances is doubly important at the moment. And if I can just have the next slide, hopefully that is where the EEF come in. And you can find more about us on our website if you're interested. But we are the government's What Works Centre for Education, and we're focused on closing two gaps. The gaps that I've already talked about, the attainment gap for social backgrounds. But in order to close that gap and impact it, we need to find out what is going to be the best educational practice for schools to support young people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. And in order to do that, we need to close the evidence gap. And so the EEF works in three ways, as characterized by the bottom bullet point on the left-hand side. We synthesize global experimental robust research on effective practice. We generate our own research characteristically through large-scale randomized controlled trial projects, and then we mobilize our findings through the education system. And we're very influential, I'm proud to say. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen, almost 2 million kids have been involved in our projects one way or another. Actually, over half of schools and education settings in the country have been involved in an EEF trial. And you can see those other metrics. 70% of school leaders say they use our famous teaching and learning toolkit to inform their decision making, and we're used by the majority of teachers as well. And of course, I think that it's our teaching and learning toolkit that can be a particular resource for governors too. So if I can have the next slide. This is on the left-hand side of your screen is a picture of our teaching and learning toolkit, the very top of it. there's a long list of different educational topic areas. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen that list running down the page of different educational issues and topics. For each one, we distill what we think is most helpful to educators to know about these different approaches and whether they're going to be useful in those schools. So we start with the pound sign indicating the relative expense or otherwise of this particular intervention or approach. The number of padlocks shows the relative robustness of the research that sits behind the intervention. And then on the right-hand side of the picture, those numeric bubbles show the number of additional months progress, or it might be a negative effect on pupil teaching and learning that is delivered by the intervention when that intervention is applied compared to children that are in schools that didn't receive the intervention. So this has been shown to be really effective, and it's now translated into many different languages and used in many different parts of the world. But the point is, we try to distill clear messages for schools. The huge array of studies and meta-analyses that sit behind these messages, you can dig on to access through the website if you're interested. So it does give you that nuance as well. If I can have the next slide, please. The best available evidence indicates that it's great teaching that's the most important lever schools have to improve outcomes for their pupils. And actually, the importance of high quality teaching is even more impactful and beneficial for kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. You know, that was true before the COVID pandemic and will be continue to be vital as schools tackle the learning loss that their pupils have experienced in the meantime. This slide shows the teaching and learning toolkit strands in order of average impacts, and it really illustrates the point that the most important lever schools have to improve pupil outcomes involve high quality interactions between the teacher and the pupil. And of course, you can see in there that interventions like tuition are also highly effective. If I can have the next slide. We've developed, in terms of pupil premium spending, what we refer to as our tiered model. And there's a specific guidance report focusing on this. It's simple, but we hope useful. It was published first in June 2019, and it sets out an approach to spending the pupil premium. It's of course a guide, not a prescription. Many strategies will overlap different categories, and the balance of categories will vary from year to year as schools' priorities change. But I think it can offer a useful framework about how to balance different forms of spending. So the bulk, you'll see, following the evidence that I've just mentioned, suggests that the mainstay of the resource should be spent ensuring every teacher is supported to keep improving. But it also might be spent, when we think about high quality teaching, that might be spent on recruitment and retention, perhaps of subject specialist teachers and so forth, or on different methods of assessment and assessment practices and the like. The second element we're suggesting about a quarter of resource is on targeted approaches, which could be structured interventions, for example, on literacy or numeracy. It could be, I've mentioned tutoring already, those kind of targeted interventions to support particular groups of pupils. And then the third area is wider strategies to make sure that every child is ready to learn. So this could be behavioural interventions, it could be whole school approaches to attendance, it might be whole school approaches to pupil well-being and mental health and so forth. But we hope this heuristic is useful for pupil premium planning, and of course also to inform the sorts of questions that governors can be asking their school leadership teams. If I can have the next slide, please. This is an indication about the importance of spending pupil premium well. When delivering, it will be crucial to make sure that it's just as important to think about implementation as it is to think about, identifying which approaches. If schools don't approach the pupil premium strategically, they risk focusing on the wrong priorities or picking approaches that aren't supported by evidence, failing to spot delivery challenges, or actually implementing approaches in a way that then doesn't have impact, so wasting the resource in terms of both time and money. Hopefully, our 4-step model outlined here supports schools to diagnose need, use evidence, implement strategy, and monitor it effectively. And again, for governors, the questioning around this approach within the pupil premium plan could be very helpful, I think. Next slide, please. And this just really drives home that point about implementation. It's really clear that how a practice is done is important as which practice is chosen. Our EEF implementation guidance report encourages schools to consider implementation as an ongoing cyclical process of planning, review, reflection and revision. And of course, it's really important that schools consider which practices to de-implement if they're not having a positive impact. The final slide shows the QR code to our Pupil Premium page on our website, which has lots of different resources. But we also have a guide for governors and trustees. There's an array of different resources and materials to supplement these. Do please explore our website, and we aim to be helpful. I really appreciate your listening. We really hope that our evidence and the resources we've built to engage schools around the evidence can help schools to support young people to thrive, irrespective of this challenging context and irrespective of their backgrounds, even in these most challenging of times. And thanks very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Becky. The toolkit sounds like a really valuable resource for governors and school leaders who are looking to kind of assess what evidence-based interventions might be right for their setting. So thank you for sharing. I'm pleased to say that we do have lots of audience questions. With the time left, we may only get to 1 or 2. So Georgina, I'm just going to start with a question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the reasons that might make children growing up in poverty not eligible for free school meals?
Yeah, so it's because at the moment in England, a family would need to be in receipt of universal credit and earning less than £7,400 a year to get free school meals. If they earn more than £7,400 a year, they wouldn't be eligible. I guess it's also because the poverty numbers are measured in a different way. So poverty is about families that fall below poverty line, which is in a different way to the way in which free school meals are currently calculated.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question for you, Becky, very briefly before we finish. You talk about evidence gaps. Can you tell us a little bit more about evidence gaps and what we should be looking for on our boards?
It's a great question, and I think the trouble is that there are very many evidence gaps, particularly when we get down to the specifics of different subject areas. We have pretty robust evidence on some areas like, for example, teacher CPD, literacy, numeracy, and so on. But if you ask me a question, for example, about best practice in teaching modern foreign language, the evidence is much more limited. And that includes some areas that are very popular. So, for example, ed tech. We recently did a systematic review of the evidence on ed tech, and it's pretty weak considering how prevalent it is for use in schools. So I think there's much more to do for the EEF. We're definitely on the journey to support schools, but do feed in areas that you feel are pressing for you as well. We really hope to be listening to our users in terms of guiding our research programme.
Fantastic, thank you. Good to know that you're kind of listening to what people have to say in terms of what to look at next. I can see that we're coming to the end of our time, so I'll wrap things up here. I can see there are a few more questions to get to, so we'll try to collate those and see if we are able to answer them after the session. Georgina and Becky, I just want to thank you again for joining this session and to share your insights on such an important topic. Thank you also to all of our delegates for tuning in, and we hope you found the session to be useful. Please do remember to check your emails for updates about session recordings, and please do also complete our exit survey to receive your CPD certificate as well. Finally, thank you again to the IET for their generous sponsorship of the conference. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.